Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on combating Asian American hate. According to the national report by Stop AAPI Hate, they received 3,795 reports of hateful behavior and speech against Asian Americans since March of last year, shortly after COVID-19 began its wave of infection in the U.S. Tonight, our panel discussion aims to dive into this alarming trend, as well as the deeper issues that lie within the racism, hate, and bigotry against Asian Americans. Joining us tonight are Representative Karen Kwan of Taylorsville, Max Chang, a community advocate, and Dr. Kent Ono, professor of communication at the University of Utah. Thank you all for being here tonight, and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll start with you, Representative Kwan. What are your own observations of the progression of anti-Asian hatred and racism through the course of the COVID-19 pandemic? We know that anti-Asian sentiments have been around prior to this. How has this personally impacted you?
Well, the hateful rhetoric that surrounds the pandemic, the terms like the Kung flu or the Chinese virus has certainly impacted our communities and led us to be fearful of what might come not only in words but also in actions. We all have seen a rise in anti-Asian hate and violence. And even though we have not had any reports of hate crimes against Asian Pacific Islanders here in Utah, we have seen nearly 800 incidents of bias.
And Max, what are some historic incidents of hate against Asian Americans that you can think of?
Well, there's actually quite a few, but I want to kind of focus more to us geographically, because a lot of times people don't think that it happens in your own neighborhood. But in 1885, in Rock Springs, Wyoming, there were it was one of the worst massacres in American history, where the miners, the Chinese miners, were targeted by a mob of more than 100 men armed with Winchester rifles. As they started shooting people through Chinatown and so forth in Rock Springs, many of them went hiding. And some of them went hiding in their homes, and they burned the homes, but they were trying to dig out. And they would find the bodies where their bottom limbs were burned to a crisp, and their upper torso was fully intact. Coming even closer to home in Park City, where China Bridge exists now for the parking lot, used to be Chinatown. And kids would take snowballs and they maybe, back then they think this is just funny, but they'd drop them down the stovepipes. And that causes smoke and forcing the Chinese out of their own homes. And eventually, through violence and acts like this, the Chinese were pushed out of Park City.
Wow, these are unbelievable events, and I don't know if many people actually know about these events. Turning to you now, Dr. Ono, Representative Kwan did touch on this a little bit, but let's talk about what kind of a role has rhetoric used by prominent figures played in anti-Asian speech and behavior?
Well, I think this language by leaders, China flu, Kung flu, Wuhan virus, Wuhan flu, it goes on and on and on. Basically tries to pin the blame of the virus on a particular people, a particular nation, a country, a location. Even though we know that viruses just emerge, right? They're biological phenomena. They are not controlled and produced by people, and this one wasn't. The idea is that China is responsible for having done this to us. Additionally, it rhetorically shifts our attention away from our own efforts to minimize or decrease the spread of the virus. So it draws attention away from what our leaders are doing and puts it on what China is doing.
Yeah, very ill-informed misconception. Dr. Ono, following up with another question, one of the biggest stereotypes that exists for Asian Americans is that we are the model minority. So how does this play a role in perhaps the lack of interest, urgency, action, or even media coverage in the hateful actions against Asian Americans?
Yeah, scholars like I have been saying for a very long time that the model minority myth is the biggest stereotype that Asian Americans face and the most detrimental. It seems counterintuitive, but the model minority myth sounds like a compliment, but in fact, labeling Asian Americans as a model minority does devastating harm to the Asian American community. It does that by implying that Asian Americans are doing fine, they're doing great, they're all succeeding, and they have no problems. And so the poverty and the lack of jobs and the difficulty that Asian Americans face in this country is ignored. And then policies aren't created to help support Asian Americans, and Asian Americans then are no longer thought of as a racialized and an oppressed community.
And that really contributes to this concept of invisible racism, which we will talk about later in this panel. Turning to you now, Max, how is this impacting Asian American children? Can you give an example of how young students are also experiencing racism stemming from the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, first of all, 1 in 4 Asian children have been subjected to some sort of bullying related to the pandemic. And of those, nearly half, or 12.5% of all Asian students were subject to this when an adult was present. So that to me is saying that the adult has kind of failed those children. Bringing it closer to home, I have a friend who is a teacher at an elementary school, and he shared an example with me of how a student went to another student who is of Asian descent, was actually a refugee from Southeast Asia, and slapped him really hard and says, "I'm trying to get that corona off of you." And while the student, as a teacher had told me, did not have ill intention, that's what actually was even more disturbing, that this is normalized. And of course, this poor child is somewhat traumatized. I think as a 4th grader, and at such a young age, to have someone physically hit you and thinking that this is normalized, this is okay to do.
And I think that shows that there's a deeper issue here that may lie within maybe the household or some sort of line of thinking that comes from parents and families. Okay, Representative Kwan, Max, and Kent, hold that thought. We do have to take a quick commercial break. But when we return, we'll resume our In Focus discussion on combating Asian American hate. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on combating Asian American hate. Before the break, we were joined by Representative Karen Kwan, Max Chang, and Dr. Kent Ono. We pick up now right where we left off. Representative Kwan, I'd like to talk a little bit about the psychology between COVID-19's impact on Asian Americans. One similar event that I can think of in U.S. history is when Muslim Americans saw an increase in hateful speech and behaviors against them after 9/11. We did talk a little bit about this. Why do we see certain ethnic groups attacked after devastating events like these?
Well, from a psychological perspective, we're social creatures. Humans are social. And we have social constructions about what is considered in-group and what is considered out-group. And this sets up an us versus them sort of society. And so if Americans are us, then there are those who are them, and that are people who are not typically seen or stereotypically seen as Americans. Now, this is something that affects Asian Americans because we are often considered a perpetual foreigner. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked where I'm from, and then if I say California, which is where I was born, people will ask, "No, where are you really from? You know what I mean." And that sets it up for that us versus them. When people are looking for a scapegoat, they look at them.
It's really that concept of otherness that's concerning here. Dr. Ono, most recently 8 people who were mostly Korean women were killed by one suspect at 3 spas in the Atlanta, Georgia area. Later on, Cherokee County Sheriff's Office Captain Jay Baker said about the shooter, quote, "It was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did." How does this play into that issue that racism against Asian Americans has been historically invisible, or that there is a continual dismissive attitude that racism against Asian Americans is imagined?
Well, definitely what he said was dismissive of the people who died and the people who were injured. And we'll see whether or not he's able to keep his job. We know he's been taken off of the case of being the main spokesperson for the event. I think what it does is focuses the attention on the perpetrator, on the alleged perpetrator of this heinous crime, and implies that the lives of the people who died were not as important as focusing on him and what a bad day he had. It's unbelievable that someone would say something like that after such a tragedy, when people are mourning, when Asian Americans are hurting and where the rest of the country is wondering, how is it that this kind of racial attack could occur?
Right. Max, this reminds you of when you got your first traffic ticket at 16 years old. Could you share what your experience was with that police officer who pulled you over?
Well, I was a little excited. It was actually the first day I got my license, the day after I turned 16. And I was probably a little bit too excited, and I got pulled over and I received a ticket. Now I was reading through the ticket, exactly seeing what was going on. The officer just interrupted and said, "What's taking you so long? Can't you read English?" And so I went to the judge, mostly to discuss, taking responsibility for the speeding. And once that, we resolved that, I said, I would like to add a statement that, and I described to her what happened. And she said to me, "Oh, don't let it bother you. He was probably just having a bad day. Maybe his coffee wasn't warm enough." And this is a continual example. Certainly mine is a much smaller scale than what's happening in Atlanta. But you go back to the Vincent Chin case in 1982, where he was brutally murdered by a baseball bat, literally hunted down in the streets of Detroit because they thought he was Japanese, when he's in fact Chinese, and that they wanted to blame him for losing their jobs, or the stepson losing their job in the auto industry. And the judge himself says, the punishment should not fit the crime, the punishment should fit what these fine people are. So they got, it's always so difficult for me to say this because it's so unbelievable. They had no jail time, a $3,000 fine, and 3 years of probation.
And this is what we mean when we talk about systemic racism. Now, Representative Kwan, Stop AAPI Hate reports that Asian American women report hate incidents 2.3 times more than men. I'd like to discuss the issue of hypersexualization of Asian women. How does it contribute to the issue that we're facing?
Yes, it absolutely does. When we're talking about the incident that happened in Georgia, we often hear people say, well, it wasn't a hate crime. But it's not so clear-cut to say that these are women who are not racialized. We have intersections within our identities that overlap, and we cannot easily take them apart, nor should we try to take them apart. One of the stereotypes on Asian women is to objectify them and to, as you say, hypersexualize them as if they are objects to be exploited. And we see this, actually, we are seeing this when the murderer is, alleged murderer is named, but the victims are not. We don't know much about the women, but these are women who have families.
Yeah, all right, a lot more to dive into. Everyone hold that thought. We have to take another quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on combating Asian American hate. We resume now with our panel, Representative Karen Kwan, Max Chang, and Dr. Kent Ono. Dr. Ono, will go to you first. Is it a possibility that there may be an underreporting and a lack of data collection for Asian American hate crimes? And if so, why?
Well, we do know that with hate crimes, they are underreported. And we know that in part because we find out later that people weren't, able, willing, capable of reporting them. Within the Asian American community, certainly like all other communities, there are people who are afraid that if they report things, bad things could happen to them. And so they don't report it. But, in addition with this hate crime issue, what constitutes a hate crime is really a high bar, both federally and in terms of state legislation. So people have seen that hate crime, when reported and when announced, often in the courts is not found to rise to the level that the court requires. And this also makes them less likely to come forward.
Yeah, and another challenge that I can think of also is language barrier. Now, Representative Kwan, even though none of the hateful incidents that's made national headlines have occurred in Utah, something like this can happen anywhere and anytime to someone that we know and love. What are you seeing as far as the emotional and mental impact that it's having on our community, and has it impacted you?
Yes, it has absolutely impacted me, and in that our communities are angry, our communities are fearful. I have been getting email after email and text after text about people who are asking me questions about, is it safe? Is it safe? Even from people out of state who want to come to Utah to travel here and asking, is this a safe place to travel? And it is. I mean, we are a safe community. There are things that we can do as Asian Americans and as allies. Asian Americans Advancing Justice has programs that can help train us for free on bystander intervention, how to step in and be a good ally. And I think that these kinds of programs, as well as knowing where to report, are very important for our communities.
Now, Dr. Ono, what can media outlets do in their coverage to help combat racist, discriminatory, and stereotypical views of Asian Americans?
I mean, the number one thing that I think media can do to combat this is to provide content that shows the rich complexity of the Asian American community and Asian American humanity. We have too few ways that we see Asian Americans. We see them in terms of stereotypes, but we need to see Asian Americans as rounded as every other community. And with those much more broad stories and those broader images, I think that will change people's perception of us.
Now, Max, how can parents have the conversation with their children at home who are struggling with what they're hearing and seeing about the Asian American community?
That's a great question. You know, children are very vulnerable at this time. One thing that has been suggested is to sometimes take a break. Take a break from your electronic devices, even turn it off, and have real conversations with your children about what is going on, and even let them lead the way, let them lead the conversation. And I think we really want to eventually help create empathy. Let them understand what's happening with other minority groups or groups that are at risk, and share our shared experience. And we have shared experiences. And I think one thing is there's a lot of great literature that's being produced of different groups of color and other group minorities, and I think that we should all share these experiences together.
Now, Representative Kwan, is this an opportunity for Asian Americans to work together with other minorities like African Americans to help solve the larger violence against people of color?
Yes, absolutely. And what we're seeing within the Asian Pacific Islander communities for this whole year, actually, is that we have come together to combat these issues. And we also are seeing that our BIPOC communities and what we lovingly call the Quad Caucus, these are the state legislators of color, we have come together to make sure that we support one another in these instances and to share resources, as Max had talked about.
Dr. Ono, I think I'm going to end this live panel discussion with you. What are some things that Utahns can do, no matter how big or small, to combat hate against Asian Americans?
I think learn more about Asian Americans, that's one. Two, encourage other people to learn about Asian Americans. Three, to make friends with Asian Americans if you aren't friends with Asian Americans, and get to understand the Asian American community.
All right, we have enough time for Max to chime in. Max, what do you think?
I think that we really have to stand up for our children. It's really, you know, let's not fail our children. Let's not be part of that 12.5% and be a bystander. If you see bullying of a child in particular, stand up for them, and that's what we need to do.
Well said. You've been hearing from Representative Karen Kwan of Taylorsville, Max Chang, a community advocate, and Dr. Kent Ono, professor of communication at the University of Utah. Thank you all for making time to participate in this panel tonight. We appreciate you all so much.
Thank you very much, Rosie.
Thank you.